Good evening. Hi, I'm Gregory Nicola. I'm the Vice Chair of Economics for the American College of Radiology and the Chair of the Macro Committee. Tonight we are presenting you a webinar titled 2019 Quality Payment Program Update. This is about the regulatory changes to the Quality Payment Program Year 3, and we're going to gear this towards several different factors. One is want to help those of us who are in small practices navigate this program. We're also going to introduce some new concepts in the finalized regulations for 2019, which will provide opportunities for radiologists and multi-specialty groups to further help their value participation inside this program. We have a couple of presenters from the MAC committee, but before we start with those presenters, I do want to thank the economics chair, Ezekiel Silva. He's provided us tremendous amount of resources to go to CMS and talk to the policymakers, making sure this program is something that radiologists can perform successfully in. I also would be remiss not to mention the fantastic American College of Radiology staff. They spend countless hours scouring through this regulations and attending CMS sessions in Baltimore, making sure our voice is heard and making sure we have the resources to be successful in this program. We have two presenters tonight. One is Dr. Lauren Golding from Triad Radiology in North Carolina. She is the vice chair of the Macro Committee. We also have Dr. Rich Heller from Radiology Partners. These are the two stars of the Macro Committee who really scour through the regulations and go into the nitty-gritty details. And I'm very honored to work with them. They're quite able, and I'm very excited to have them speak tonight. We'll start off with Dr. Lauren Golding, who's going to give a broad general overview before Dr. Heller dives a little more deeper into the program. So without further ado, Dr. Golding, go ahead and take the mic.
Great. Thanks, Greg. So what I want to do tonight is focus on some of the key changes for MIPS in 2019. I'm going to start off with kind of a big picture overview of some of the concepts that are changing, figure out where we are in this program right now and where it's headed in the next couple of years. Then Rich is going to take over and he's going to give some more granular, detailed view of some of the changes specific to the 4 performance categories in MIPS. We'll finish up with some Q&A, so get your questions ready. We're really interested in how you guys are faring in this program. You've had at least a year or two of experience and some feedback, so we really want this to be interactive, so gather your questions ready. So before I dive into any of the major changes, and in the spirit of the new year, I want to reflect a little bit on the past. So we have the results from 2017, year 1 of the Quality Payment Program. We have those data from the payment adjustment results, and I want to look at some of these and highlight some of the trends that I think are important and some of the lessons that I think we can learn from that. So how do clinicians across the country do in MIPS in year 1? Well, CMS designed this program to be a kind of a gradual ramp up so that the first couple of years were pretty easy, and then it got harder as it gets into full implementation. So they expected year 1 to be very easy, and as we expected, a lot of people did well. In fact, 71% of people did really, really well and got a positive payment adjustment and the bonus payment for exceptional performance. We saw that 5% got a negative payment adjustment, and those are the people who just decided that this year it wasn't worth it, didn't pay attention to the program and didn't participate at all. 2% got the neutral payment adjustment. That was for doing kind of the bare minimum to get that 3 points that they needed to avoid a negative payment adjustment. What did the scores look like? Well, remember, this is a 100-point scale, so the scores were really high with a mean of 74 points and a median of 89 points in the first year of the program. So people did really well. They scored high. I think that was more or less expected. But I want you to keep these numbers in mind, this mean and median in mind, because I'm going to talk about why this is really important as the program moves forward. Let's review the how your MIPS score translates into your payment adjustment. So as you know, the magnitude of your bonus payments or your penalties is defined by law, and it escalates from plus or minus 4% to plus or minus 9% over the first few years of the program. Now, the downside is pretty straightforward. If you decide not to participate at all, if you decided not to participate at all in 2017, you're giving up 4% of your Medicare payments. If you decide not to participate at all in 2019, you're giving up 7% of your Medicare payments. So that's the downside. That's what you stand to lose. What do you stand to gain? Well, the upside's not quite as straightforward. we saw all those high numbers. So we had lots of people who got scores in the 80s, 90s, and even 100. Those people may have been expecting a plus 4% payment adjustment for their 2017 score, maybe even higher with that bonus payment. But what we saw in reality was this. So this is a feedback report from a group that scored perfectly. So they got 100 out of 100 points, perfect score. And their payment adjustment here is 1.88%. And if you look even more closely, the MIPS payment adjustment is only 0.29%. The rest of that is that exceptional performance bonus. So why is there this discrepancy? Why is there a difference between those numbers that we saw on the slide before and this slide? Well, it's because the MIPS is a budget neutral program. As you know, the losers pay the winners. So the amount of money available to pay the winners all depends on how many losers there are. And that depends on the performance threshold that's set by CMS. And that's just a score out of the 100 that CMS picks that divides the winners from the losers. And that changes year to year, and that impacts how much money is available in the pool to pay the people that do well. I think this is an important concept, and it helps us understand how this program is going to change over the coming years. So I'm going to just take a few minutes to explain it. I stole this slide from Greg because I think it does a really good job of explaining this concept nicely. So in year one of the program in 2017, the performance threshold was 3 points. It's intentionally set very, very low. What that means is that there's only a few losers, only a few people, that 5% that we saw, that got a negative payment adjustment. The consequence of that is that the money available to pay the winners is also really small. So you've got a small amount of money distributed over a ton of people who got over 3 points. So the actual bonus you're seeing is pretty low. On the statute, CMS set aside, or Congress set aside $500 million to use as a bonus payment. That's outside of budget neutrality, and that money is distributed over clinicians who perform above a second threshold that's called the exceptional performance threshold. That number is 70 points for 2017, 2018. CMS has increased it to 75 for 2019. So year two of the program, in 2018, the performance threshold increased to 15 points. So there's a few more losers, a handful more losers, and a little bit more money available to pay the winners. Still, there's not a whole lot of difference between people who just knocked this out of the park and people that did okay. Now here we are in 2019. This is year three. The performance threshold is 30 points. You can see the same story. There's more losers this time, so there's more money available for the winners. Like I said, they increased that exceptional performance threshold from 70 to 75 points, so the slope of that line gets a little bit steeper too. So now we're dealing with potentially a little bit more upside money and more available if you do well in this program. Also, the consequences are higher. So we see that first minus 4% and then minus 5% and then minus 7% for 2019. So what happens in the future? And this is kind of the big unknown. So by law, the performance threshold has to be set at either the median or the mean of all the distribution of performers, of all the scores. Originally, in the original macro statute, that was supposed to happen this year in 2019, that the score is supposed to be set at either the median or the mean. And you saw those numbers that I showed you. Just keep in mind that median and the mean for 2017 was in the 80s or 90s. I think Congress very wisely realized that clinicians weren't ready to have that big of a jump in the performance threshold this early. And so in the Bipartisan Budget Act passed in February of 2018, they gave CMS the flexibility to gradually increase the performance threshold over the next couple years so that it doesn't have to be the median or the mean until year 6 of the program. But if nothing else changes in the law, then by year 6, the performance threshold is going to be quite a bit higher than it is now. And the consequence of that is that there's going to be a lot of losers and a lot of potential upside money for the winners. That could be a maximum of up to 37% positive adjustment on your Medicare payments by then. So I think the point of that is that if you got your feedback report for 2017, saw those measly dollars and thought, well, what am I doing? Is this even worth it? I'm spending a ton of money on my office staff and resources trying to get these measures submitted. Is this even worth it? Well, in the beginning, maybe not. It's a little bit hard to justify that when we're seeing 1 to 2% returns on that. But in the next couple of years, again, if nothing changes, those stakes are going to get a lot higher, and the investment that you're making now may pay dividends in the future. The other thing to remember is that investment that you're making in your practice, learning how to measure quality, learning how to account for accountability and cost and resource use, those are skills that you're really going to need as your health system transitions to value-based care. And so it's not a wasted investment. Another trend that I wanted to make note of in the 2017 report, performance report feedback, is that groups performed a lot better than individuals, quite a bit more. So remember, you can report into MIPS either as an individual or as a group within your TIN, your taxpayer ID number. And groups perform better than individuals. I think this is probably because groups are more likely to submit their quality measures using a qualified clinical data registry or QCDR, or a qualified registry rather than claims. So if you are submitting as an individual, you may want to look into your options as reporting, group for group reporting, maybe switching over to registry measures that may help you maximize your score. The last point I want to make from the 2017 results is this. Small practices are really struggling in this program. I think this is probably the biggest discrepancy in scores that we've seen among subsets. The small practices had a median of about 38 points. That's out of the 100. And that's a big deal, and CMS has acknowledged that it's a big deal. The ACRs continue to really aggressively advocate for our small practice radiology members, and they've responded by continuing to support the little guy. So for 2019, CMS has continued to offer provisions to help small practices. They've added a couple. They're keeping the small practice bonus. So in the first 2 years of the program, they gave you 5 additional points on your final score if you were a small practice, and that's 15 or fewer eligible clinicians in your 10. So in 2019, they're keeping the bonus, but they're changing it so that instead of 5 points to your final score, you're going to get 6 points added to the score in your quality category. And they did that because they think that the quality category is the one that really small practices struggle with the most. It turns out that those 6 points may have even greater impact for radiologists because most of us are non-patient facing, so our quality category is weighted greater than our other categories. So I think that's going to be an advantage for us over years in the past. CMS is going to continue to offer technical support at no cost to all small practices. They're going to continue to give small practices double points for their improvement activities so that they only have to do half of what a non-small practices would have to do for that category. In 2019, CMS is going to let small practices, both individuals and groups, submit using claims data. In the first 2 years, only individuals could submit using claims. In 2019, they want to really move away from anybody using claims, but they want to protect small practices and not force them to have to purchase registries or infrastructure that they don't have. So small practices will continue to be able to submit with claims, whether you're individual or a group. Also, small practices will continue to get a minimum of 3 points for all the quality measures they submit, even if they don't meet the data completeness threshold. If you're not a small practice and you submit a measure doesn't meet that threshold, you're only going to get 1 point for it. In 2019, you're not going to get any points for it after that. But small practices, if they put the effort forward, are going to get a little bit more points for that. Also, small practices will have an application-based exemption. So if they submit an application for hardship exemption, they won't have to participate in the promoting interoperability category. So if you're a small practice in radiology and you don't meet the non-patient facing criteria, the hospital-based criteria, you can be exempt from the promoting interoperability category as well. And then finally, CMS is going to continue to offer the virtual group option, which was new for 2018. And that allows members of small practices, 10 ECs, 10 eligible clinicians or less, to join together, pool their resources anywhere really across the country to submit to MIPS. All right, so we tend to focus on the components of MIPS and MACRA relevant to radiologists, but we have to remember that this is really a broad program. It involves not just radiologists, not just physicians, but really all clinicians across the care team. And that's intentional on CMS's part. They really want to focus, you'll see a recurring theme of encouraging participation and team-based care across the care team. So in 2019, they've added some eligible clinician types. They've added physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, registered dietitians, and audiologists, and clinical psychologists. So they can also participate in MIPS. Some of our members who may be parts of larger multi-specialty practices maybe employ some of these types of clinicians. Certainly lots of us work with them, so it's important to know that now they're involved in this as well. So we talked about who's in for 2019. There's also some changes in who's out for 2019. CMS has changed the low volume threshold to add a third criteria that would exclude you from having to participate in MIPS. They've kept the dollar amount if you bill Medicare less than $90,000 a year, or if you see less than 200 beneficiaries within a year, you're excluded. And then starting in 2019, if you bill less than 200 covered professional services, you can also be exempt from MIPS. Also new in 2019 is the option that if you do meet these criteria to be excluded, if you meet one or two of them, then you can opt in to participate in MIPS. If you want to participate and you think you have a chance at getting a positive payment adjustment, you can choose to report into MIPS and see how you fare. One of the other big picture themes that I think that's one of the changes we've got our eye on for 2019 and beyond is the increasing impact of cost on our scores. Cost didn't count at all in 2017. It was measured and reported, but it was 0% of your score. In 2018, it's 10% of your score. In 2019, it will be 15% of your score, and it's going to increase gradually until it gets up to the 30% that's mandated by law. So Rich is going to go into a little bit more detail about cost, but this is still really a black box for us. There's a lot of unknowns in this category. We are seeing some radiologists who are being attributed one of the cost measures called Medicare Spending Per Beneficiary, or MSPB. That's a measure that assesses all of the costs related to an inpatient admission, and it's attributed to the clinician who bills the plurality of Medicare Part B services for a patient. And sometimes that is a radiologist, especially in the case of maybe an interventional radiologist who's doing some expensive procedures on a patient, or a radiologist who's reading solely in the ER and running through a bunch of cross-sectional imaging on a trauma patient who ends up not getting a lot of other care while they're in the hospital. So CMS has acknowledged that radiologists probably don't have a lot of control over some of these inpatient costs, and maybe it's not the right thing to assign these costs in this way. So they're currently revising the attribution methodology for MSPB so that it's based on E&M services. I think at first we thought that that would get most radiologists out of the cost category, but based on some preliminary field testing reports, it's not entirely clear if that's going to be the case. I think certainly some radiologists will still be seeing MSPB impacting their score, and so it's something that we should be aware of. They're also adding a third category of cost measures, the episode-based cost measures. We've talked about those in these webinars before, and Rich is going to talk about the ones that are specifically coming in 2019. I think a few of our radiologists will be attributed some of these measures as well. And I think the bottom line for the cost category and what's important to remember is that even if you aren't specifically attributed these measures, CMS has been clear over and over again that the cost category is intended to be reflective of this concept of team-based accountability. So they really want everyone working together to reduce the cost of care. So even if it's not specifically measured in your MIPS score, we need to be doing everything that we can in our health systems to make sure that we're doing our part for resource utilization. That means making sure that imaging is utilized appropriately. That means making sure that our follow-up recommendations are based on guidelines, and that our reports are clear and actionable, and that we're being the stewards of imaging that we should be in the category of cost. And I think in that way, we really can provide some value to our systems, whether or not this impacts our score directly or not. Along the lines of team-based accountability, so the final rule for 2019 finalized a measurement option called facility-based measurement, and that's a new way of being measured, and it applies to clinicians who provide most of their services in a hospital setting. And the way that works is if you provide more than 75% or greater of your services in the emergency department, inpatient, or on-campus outpatient hospital setting, you can be eligible for this type of measurement. And what CMS will do is in the background automatically calculate a score for you for your MIPS quality and cost category based on your hospital's value-based purchasing score. I'm not going to go in the details of the value-based purchasing program, but it's basically a quality and cost measurement program within hospitals that facilities are measured by. There's currently, I think, 12 measures in there. Your hospital has a score for it, and if you meet this criteria, CMS will use that score, calculate that score for you, and apply it to you. And then what they'll do is they'll take the higher of either your facility-based measurement score or your MIPS score and use that for your final score in MIPS. So does that mean you should just throw off the shackles of MIPS and ignore this whole thing and accept your facility-based measurement score? I think that's a pretty risky thing to do. I would not recommend that. My recommendation would be to let this go on in the background, kind of pretend it's not there, and then if the score tends to be higher than your MIPS score, then great, you've done a little bit better. I think it's pretty risky to assume your hospital is going to do well in VBP unless you just are assured that they are going to knock it out of the park. The other thing I think this allows is a little bit more collaboration between radiologists and our hospitals and our health systems. And if we are knowledgeable of these VBP measures that really matter to our facilities, and we find ways that we can help them perform better, then we're really demonstrating our value in those settings. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And finally, I just want to end with one more sort of big picture change, big picture topic, and it's specifically relevant to multi-specialty practices and multi-specialty groups. And so CMS has made a lot of really broad sweeping changes to the structure of APMs, specifically the shared saving program. So I think that we're going to see in the near future a lot of these multi-specialty practices that have been participating in shared savings get back into MIPS. And so what does that mean for our radiologists? Well, I think that it's a common misconception that in these large multi-specialty groups, the primary care people submit the measures, they take care of it, and everyone else kind of just hangs out and watches it happen from the stands. But there's a real opportunity for us to, again, demonstrate our value in our systems in these settings. So generally, the leadership of these practices is primary care, and they know about primary care measures, and they're going to choose and submit primary care measures. There's no reason at all in MIPS that the quality measures have to be primary care. They could be radiology measures. So by scoring as well as possible on radiology specific measures and bringing those to the attention of your multi-specialty practice leadership, you may be able to use those measures and increase the score of your whole multi-specialty practice. And in that way, you're really bringing a lot of value to your system. You're making yourself visible. You're making yourself valuable. And I think that that's going to be key as you start moving towards population-based payments and risk-based payments. It's going to be a good way to identify ourselves and make ourselves stand out. So that's all I have on the big picture side of things. I'm going to turn it over to Rich and let him go category by category with more specific changes for 2019.
Thank you, Lauren. I hope everybody can hear me okay. That was fantastic. And I hope everybody can see my screen. So I'll be going into the individual categories. So this is the outline of what I'll be talking about. I'm first going to talk about the weighting of the 4 categories and then go in depth into the 4 individual performance categories, highlighting the things that are new or most relevant to the radiologist. Obviously, there's lots of details with any of these categories, so I'm going to try not to get too bogged down in the weeds, but really focus on things that are new and really particularly relevant for us in radiology. And I've tried to design slides that are really good for screen capture. So if somebody wants some easy, quick details, I've tried to create slides that you can just sort of screen capture and give you some helpful details and some information on that. So in terms of the 4 categories, so the weighting. So this is a step-by-step look at the first 3 years of the quality payment program and how the 4 performance categories are weighted. Now, the 2019 payment year, which was the first year of the quality payment program, it was the 2017 performance year because there's that 2-year lag. So in that 2019 payment year, again, the 2017 performance year, quality was weighted at 60%. What I want you to notice is that when you go to the 2020 or last year, the 2020 payment year or the 2018 performance year, it actually goes down to 50% because cost comes in. And then you see the final year we are right now, 2021 MIPS payment year, which is the 2019 performance year. This is the weighting for the 4 performance categories for a physician who's patient-facing, just regular physician, patient-facing. This is how they would be weighted. What I want you to notice is that quality is going down year by year as cost goes up. But what happens in radiology, and you can see on this slide, is that many of us are not going to be scored on cost or promoting interoperability, or maybe both. And how does that change the weighting? Well, imagine you're not scored on cost. That's the first column. If you're not scored on cost, well, then those points, that weighting from cost, gets transferred over to quality. And quality goes from being worth 45% of your score to 60% of your score. Well, what if you can't be scored on promoting interoperability? Well, that 25% gets taken from the PI category and given to quality. So instead of quality being worth 45%, now it's worth 70% of your score. And what's going to be true for many in radiology is they won't be scored on cost or promoting interoperability. So both of those points will be given over to quality. And so quality will be weighted at 85%. So what I think is fair to say is that no matter who you are, quality is going to be a significant part of your overall score. And in radiology, for many of us, it's going to be the majority of our score. And for some of us, it's going to be the overwhelming majority of our score is going to be in the quality category. So with that said, I will dive into the quality category. So its weighting, again, it's going to be somewhere between 45% and 85% of your total score. And the time period of which they're measuring is the complete calendar year for 2019. So since it's already like early January, the clock has already started ticking for when quality measures from 2019 count. So we're already in 2019. Now, how do you submit with the quality measures? Well, I'll talk about the individual and the group separately. So at the individual level, you can use a qualified registry. Now, just a bit of backup on this. A qualified registry is like a third-party system that uses the regular MIPS measures that you can then electronically submit and work through them to submit these measures. That's different than a QCDR, which is a qualified clinical data registry. I recognize that people hate the acronyms of MAC and all the health policy stuff, and I apologize. There are lots of acronyms. So a QCDR, it's different than a qualified registry because in addition to having the MIPS measures, the regular measures, they have their own special measures called QCDR or non-MIPS measures. So it's another third party that you can use to submit MIPS measures, but the benefit of the QCDR, or one of them, is they have additional measures from which you can choose. Now, you can also do claims reporting, but again, as Lauren mentioned, this is only possible if you are in a small practice, an individual in a small practice. Now, on the group side, it's kind of similar to the individual. You can use a qualified registry to submit. You can use a QCDR, and you can use claims. Again, only if you are a small practice can you use claims. Now, there's something called ECQM, which I wanted to draw attention to. This is these electronic clinical quality measures. So this is a list of measures that are, I think, exclusively patient-facing type measures, a lot of primary care stuff, not radiology. So my hypothesis is that there are people that are in multi-specialty practices, and the radiology folks in that think that, I don't need to worry about macro, I don't need to worry about this stuff because people that we submit, we use ECQM, there are no ECQM radiology measures, I'm not going to worry about this stuff. And I think, and unfortunately, these people probably aren't on the phone call, by the way, because they're like, I don't need to worry about it. So I'm probably going to be now directing my comments to people that aren't even on the call. But if you are on the call and you are in a multi-specialty group that's using ECQM, I would encourage you, you can still submit measures using the other mechanisms. So you can submit via a qualified registry or a QCDR. You can still submit those. And I think that benefits you. One is, it may very well be that the scores that you get on radiology measures outperform the ECQM measures that your multi-specialty colleagues are actually getting. So you can actually be doing better. And you can, this third year, you can actually use multiple submission mechanisms for quality. So you can have some of the measures submitted via the ECQM mechanism, and you could have some through a QCDR or through a qualified registry. And even if, the ECQM measures that your colleagues are presenting are actually really, really good, I think this is a nice way for radiology to show our value and be part of the care team. So if you're part of a multi-specialty group that's using ECQM, you're not left out. You can absolutely still submit, and we think that's a great way for you to show your engagement and your support for the program. And oh, by the way, it may actually help your score. Now, I'll give a quick plug for the American College of Radiology's QCDR. The American College of Radiology's QCDR is called the National Radiology Data Registry, or NRDR. And again, I apologize for the acronyms because I've literally used a sentence, the ACDR's QCDR, the NRDR. And you can have an entire sentence and actually not use words other than acronyms. So there are a lot of advantages to using QCDRs like the NRDR. So as I alluded to previously, in addition to having those MIPS measures, it has additional measures, so-called non-MIPS or QCDR measures. So you have more measures from which to choose. And you can submit both quality and your improvement activities using a single interface, and that makes things a little bit easier. You can also, if you're doing QI projects, quality improvement projects, it can be very helpful to use these registries for assistance with data compilation, even aside from having to do the MIPS stuff. It's just helpful to have this for QI projects. You'll get feedback on the data, and you can also review and select the measures you're going to report on prior to submission. So if you want to increase your chance for getting a good score, you'd like to know, hey, what measures did we do well on? And then you can sort of select those things, and you can sort of play with it a little bit when you use these QCDRs. And that's one way you can help yourself get a better score. Completeness threshold. Now, this is unchanged. It was 60%, and it's still 60%. Now, a few caveats. One, this is likely to go up in the future. And here's what it means, is that for both claims and registry reporting, you have to submit data on 60% of the patients that you see. So if you have, 100, claims or 100 incidents or 100 patients, you have to submit data on 60% of those. And there's a little bit of cherry picking then. You can see where you did well, and you can sort of help your score. So you can see why the higher up this number goes, the less cherry picking you can have. So it's still at 60%. So there's still some degree of gamesmanship you can do and some cherry picking, which is helpful for us, right now in scoring, but we expect this to go up in the long term. But for right now, they held the completeness threshold stable at 60%. Now, what about top-down measures? Just as a bit of background, top-down measures are measures that people are doing really, really, really well on just across the board. And so CMS doesn't love that. They want to find things that maybe there's some variability on, there's room for improvement. If a measure is topped out in CMS's mind, maybe there's not as much room for improvement because it seems like everybody's doing really well on it. So last year they implemented what they called a 4-year life cycle, which is that if people are doing really well on a measure, they're going to flag it. They're going to say, hey, by the way, in year 3, they're going to say, hey, we cap the points. You don't get 10 points for this measure. You only get 7. And oh, by the way, we're going to propose to take this away next year. And that was their idea with the 4-year life cycle. That's going to continue on. What they've changed is they've added something called extremely topped out. So it's not just topped out. It's like if you were in Boston, you would say it's wicked topped out. It's extremely topped out. People are just doing fantastic on it. And what they said is if a measure is extremely topped out, well, then they can actually accelerate this program to remove a measure, and they can do it in the next rulemaking cycle. So some measures they may flag, hey, everyone's doing well on this. It's extremely topped out. We're going to move on to a different measure. A few measure updates. So if you want an actual list of the MIPS quality measures, I put it right here. It's in the final rule on page 2,241, so you can see all the list of diagnostic radiology measures. They actually did remove 2 measures, measures 359 and 363. I actually don't know who was using them. 359 was actually a topped-out measure previously, but these were the 2 measures from radiology which they did remove. Now, CMS also made the point that going forward, one of their ideals is to start de-emphasizing removing process measures. And so we'll see what they do for radiology, because if we're being honest, a lot of our measures are process measures, particularly in diagnostic radiology. And so you don't want to take away too many measures. So we'll see what's going to happen there, and that's something to keep an eye on. But that is a stated goal of CMS, to limit the number of process measures. A few words on bonus points. Now, Lauren touched on this a little bit. So for high priority measures, not much changed. So what I mean by that is, yeah, a few things change, yeah, but not that relevant to radiology. For example, they made opioid-related measures a high priority, and so you can get some bonus points there. But all in all, this high priority measure, that didn't change. End-to-end electronic reporting also didn't change. Now, in terms of these bonus points, one thing that CMS has said is that don't get too addicted to them, that this might not be something that lasts in the long term. As Lauren pointed out, the scores were, rather high. The median and mean scores were rather high. So, CMS has alluded to, and we suspect they will at some point, start pulling back on bonus scores. So for right now, while you still can use them, absolutely use them, but recognize that down the road, these may become less and less available. Something else that Lauren alluded to, which is very important for small practices, and this is a change. It used to be that you would get 5 points added to your final score for being a small practice, but now it's 6 points added onto the quality. But you have to actually submit some data. You got to submit data on at least one quality measure if you're a small practice. And if you do that, they will add 6 points onto the numerator of your quality score. Now, I included complex patients here, even though it's not quality section, but because it was the bonus points slide, so I figured it fits in here. Just to let people know, there's no change here. There is still a bonus point for complex patients. There's nothing for you to do. You can get up to five points on your final score. No change from year 2 of quality, from year 2 of the QPP, but it is worth noting that there is that possibility of getting additional points based on complex patients. Now, what about improvement scoring? Because this is fully active right now, is important, and people sort of, I think, have some questions on it. So I'm going to walk you through the idea of improvement scoring. at sort of the 50,000 foot level, the idea is if you do really well this year compared to how you did last year, if there's really that delta, that jump up, wow, you did a lot better this year, you get in some extra points for doing well, for improving. But there are a few caveats. First, you have to fully participate, meaning that, yeah, you got to submit all the required measures. You got to do it for the full year. You got to meet the completeness threshold. You got to do all that stuff. But if you're all in, you did all the stuff, great, you're eligible. And what they've said is to sort of maybe keep people from like tweaking it too much, that like, let's say you bombed the previous year and you got, 10% in your quality score, they're not going to let you go from 10% to 90%. They're going to say that the worst we're going to calculate the number on from the prior year is 30%. So if you actually scored 10% on quality last year, they're not going to give you that 10%, like let you jump up. They're going to assume a floor of 30% for that prior year. And so I've included on the right side of the slide sort of an example of how they do it, what the formula they use is, and how they do it. So if this year your quality score was 60% and last year it was 50%, well, that's 0.2 or 20%. They take 10% of that, and they're going to add those 2 percentage points onto your final quality score. So 60 plus 2 is 62%. And that's how they would do improvement scoring. And again, this is only for the quality section. They get previous years flirted with the idea of doing it for cost. They're not. It's only for quality, and it does not apply if you're doing facility-based measures. So if you're doing facility-based measures, it doesn't count. One thing that is worth pointing out, though, is because it's being done at the category level, the measures can change year to year. So you can do completely separate measures this year than you did last year, and that's totally fine. That's totally fine. You can still do improvement scoring. What they're going to look at is the actual score you got, not the individual measures. So that was the quality category. Let's transition and talk about cost, something Lauren alluded to. So it's weighted at 15% this year. It's the full calendar year. There's nothing for you to do. The submission requirements are automatic. You don't actually submit anything. That's all done automatically. And remember, if they can't score you on cost, that weighting goes over to the quality category. So here's how cost is being weighted. So this year it's 15%, and that was finalized in the rule. It's supposed to go up 5% per year to the maximum of 30%, which is required by statute. And so what they've said they plan to do is go up 5% per year. So 15% this year, 20% weight next year, 25% the following year, up to 30% weight in year 6. That's how cost should be weighted. And I think this emphasizes the idea behind MACRA, behind the actual legislation, which was really to emphasize value, both quality and cost. Most of the measures we've talked about are quality-centric, so the other part of that value equation is cost. So it makes sense that they really are trying to emphasize this cost idea. So what are the cost measures? So as Lauren alluded to, you've got total per capita cost. This is not changed from year 2. This is really aimed at primary care providers, but no change from last year. The other one, Medicare spending per beneficiary. Again, as Lauren mentioned, radiology may get caught up here. For better or worse, we can be caught up here, particularly if you're interventional or particularly if you read a lot of trauma. It may very well be that it's the radiologist who has the plurality of charges on an inpatient episode. And it's a minimum of 35 cases. So if you have more than 35 cases attributed to you and then your practice, then you will be charged for cost. But if you do not meet the case minimum, they cannot score you for cost, and that weight will then be given to the quality category. Again, this is not changed from year 2, but it is worth that review. What is new for year 3 are these episode-based cost measures. Now, this is new. So they said there are 8 episode-based cost measures. 5 of these are procedure-based, and 3 of these are acute inpatient condition-based. And I want to draw your attention to one of these. This revascularization for lower extremity chronic critical limb ischemia. This is clearly centered at interventional radiology. So these procedure codes are attributed based on CPT codes. So when you build a CPT code, that triggers it. Now, obviously IR, if you do more than 10 of these in a year, you will then be charged for cost. You will then be attributed to this, and then interventional radiology can certainly be caught up in cost because they do a lot of lower extremity chronic critical limb ischemia stuff. For the acute inpatient stuff, you have to have 20 episodes, and this one may be tougher for radiology. But I have 2 take-home points really about these episode-based cost measures. First, This will impact some people in radiology for sure, particularly if you have a busy interventional practice, then yes, this will impact some people in radiology for sure. But I bet a lot of people in radiology will not be impacted by cost directly, meaning that there's going to be reweighted to quality. But for these people, I still want to make the point that if you look at the other categories, intracranial hemorrhage or cerebral infarction, pneumonia, MI, even though these are not necessarily radiology-centric per se, radiology still has a significant role to play. And so as we talk about cost and the intuition, the idea behind the legislation, I think that we have an important role in radiology to play in terms of care coordination, in terms of controlling cost, in terms of working with our colleagues, that obviously a lot of the costs do involve radiology, and we can probably do our part to help sort of limit costs, even in these things for which we are not directly being scored. And I think that's just sort of an important part of being a part of the care team. Now, what about improvement activities? This is really unchanged. My take-home message for improvement activities is very simple. There is absolutely no reason not to get full credit for this. It's 15%. There's not really big exclusions. It's going to be weighted across the board 15%, and everybody should be getting 100% and getting all of your points on this because it's pretty straightforward. So as a brief review, to get full credit, if you are patient-facing, you have to attest to doing either 4 medium-weighted activities or 1 high-weighted and 2 medium, or just 2 high-weighted. But many people in radiology are non-patient-facing, in a small practice, in a rural practice, or in so-called HPSA, or health professional shortage areas. If you are one of these, you only have to do half as much. If you do 1 high-weighted activity or 2 medium-weighted activities, you get full credit. This is going to be a lot of radiology. So you only have to do half as much, and you will get full credit. One point to make is that for our referring physicians, if you are using CDS in your system, they can get high-weighted improvement activity credit. It won't credit radiology, but it does credit our referring physician colleagues. This can be sort of a nice thing you can help them with and be like, hey, just so you know, we're using CDS. You guys can use this as part of your MIPS as a highly weighted improvement activity. How can you submit? Well, you can use those qualified registries, again, the QCDRs. You can actually log into CMS directly and simply attest to it. I don't actually know of any auditing process they're doing yet or how we actually have to keep track of it, but yes, you can simply attest that we are doing this for 90 continuous days. Very straightforward. Now, what are some ways you can actually get your full credit? So I'll give a little plug here for the RSCAN program. So if you are doing RSCAN, we're called the Radiology Support Communication and Alignment Network. If you are taking part in RSCAN, there is a list. Here are 7 individual improvement activity measures, all medium weighted, that you can then claim you are doing because of RSCAN. Recall that if you are non-patient facing, you only need to be doing 2 of them. Here's a list of 7. So there's absolutely no reason not to be getting full credit for improvement activities. Very easy to do the RSCAN program, and then you've got a list of different IAs that you can choose from to more than simply meet the measure, to really go beyond meeting the measure. So let's conclude by talking about promoting interoperability. In my opinion, one of the more confusing categories. So you may remember it as meaningful use. It then changed names to advancing care information. That didn't last very long. And so now in year 3, we're calling it promoting interoperability, or PI. It's weighted at 25%, and the time period is 90 continuous days. And there's sort of good news and bad news. Again, I'm speaking for myself now. The good news, I think, is that there's a lot of ways that in radiology this won't apply to us. The bad news, again, in my opinion, is that I do think it is a bit of a confusing subject. So how do you get excluded? There's no real change from year 2. If you're non-patient facing, if you're hospital-based, or if you have a significant hardship. And as Lauren alluded to, that significant hardship can include being in a small practice. There's lots of various hardships they list. One of them would be being in a small practice. And then you can get excluded from promoting interoperability. And if they can't score it, those points go to the quality category, which in my opinion is an advantage because we can really focus our activities on quality and not have to worry about doing well here, here, and here, but focus on doing really, really well in quality, which I think helps patients and will certainly help our scores. So a few updates on promoting interoperability. where you have to use the 2015 edition of Certified Electronic Health Record Technology. And what I got confused was they created this whole new scoring methodology. Now, they eliminated the base, the performance, the bonus scores done in the past, and they created a new performance-based scoring, which is done at the individual measure level, which I think is maybe end up being very useful. So what they mean by that is each measure is scored based on the MIPS eligible clinician performance for that measure. And then those scores for each individual measure are then added up to calculate the total score, up to 100 possible points. And they talk about these 4 objectives. Clinicians are required to report certain measures from each of the 4 objectives that you see here, unless an exception is claimed. And there's lots of math involved. But that's promoting interoperability. So my take-home message is pretty straightforward. For quality, I think that from everybody, it's going to be a large part of your score. And for a lot of people, it's going to be a majority or a huge majority of your score. And I would put a lot of emphasis on doing well in the quality section. Cost, you may or may not be scored on it, but you shouldn't think that we're exempt from it because we're not. But even if you're not going to be scored on it, I think that radiology has an important supportive role to play. Improvement activities, there is absolutely no reason to not get full credit for improvement activities. It's very straightforward, and the RSCAN program through the ACR is a very easy way to get full credit while doing the right thing for your patients in your practice. And that promoting interoperability, it is an important subject. However, I do think that many radiologists are going to be excluded and can refocus their attention on the quality subject. So with that, I will conclude and thank you, and I'm sure we can open this up to questions.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Rich and Lauren. That was absolutely fantastic. This is Greg Nicola again. We are going to take some questions. On the webinar browser, there is a hand to raise, or if you'd like to ask a question verbally. There's also a question box you can type in, and our staff will read the questions out loud to us. Before we take questions, I just want to have a couple closing comments, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of questions. One is that I do want to thank and also stress what both presenters talked about, that there are options for small practices to do better. One that we didn't touch too much upon is the option of virtual groups, joining other small groups to try to maximize your score and potentially use a group reporting option instead of claims-based. I do want to stress that we hear far too often that multi-specialty groups and radiologists in those groups don't feel like they have to participate in MIPS because it's taken care of by their organization. And I think this is dangerous thinking as we progress into value-based care. And I highly recommend now, with the ability to use multiple submission mechanisms, new for 2019, that radiologists in those groups get involved and get submitting measures, because you really can add significant value and become visible. And Lauren did an excellent job, and I'm not trying to re-summarize what she did because she said it perfectly. I just want to stress it. There's been a lot of criticisms of this program. We've all heard MedPAC's criticisms where they have asked Congress to basically toss this program out. Our opinion as experts in health policy is this is probably not going to happen. We've seen 2 legislative fixes to MACRA. I suspect we will see more, but complete abolishment of this program, in my opinion, is pretty unlikely, and we should pay attention to the permutations and get involved as soon as possible. And finally, you probably all noticed that we've solely concentrated on the merit-based incentive payment system. Many of you also know the quality payment program includes a alternate payment model pathway. We have not forgotten about that pathway. In fact, we are planning an excellent webinar in the next month or two that'll be a Q&A with several APM experts. We will be advertising that shortly, and that'll be another opportunity to hear what's going on in the QPP for 2019 and some thoughts from some excellent speakers. So at this point, we'll accept a few questions before the top of the hour. Thank you.
Hello, there is a hand raised by Kelly McAleese. Kelly, I'm going to unmute your line.
Hello?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Excellent presentations, by the way. Excellent. So we're breast imagers, and we do see patients, but Some of the work that we do, of course, is diagnostic. Some of the work we do is screening only. Does that take, is there some advantageous position to be in as far as taking advantage of the clinical work, or trying not to take advantage of the clinical work and being assessed on many of these measures?
We're going to let Lauren answer.
Yeah, I'll
by the way.
Go ahead.
Kelly, I think that's a great question. I'm a breast imager as well, and in fact, we just finished an article about how MIPS and macro specifically relates to breast imagers, and how breast imagers are kind of leaders in the kind of in the concepts of value-based care. To answer your question, there's specifically there's measures within the Qualified Clinical Data Registry that Rich mentioned, the ACR's NRDR. There's measures in the National Mammography Database that are specific to breast imagers. There's a whole set of those. There's 4 or 5 of them. Positive predictive value for biopsy, recall rate. There's a couple like that. And some of them we do really well on. So I think that it's an opportunity for breast imagers to lead the way by performing well and scoring well on those measures, and offering those up to our groups is a way to contribute to their score. The other thing is, just like you said, we're used to talking to patients. We're used to doing a lot of things that are valued in the value-based care transformation. So we're sort of an example and a role model to other diagnostic radiologists, and ways that we can get involved, ways that we can be more conscious about resource utilization and shared decision making. So I think there's a lot of ways where we can be valuable. I don't know if you had any specific questions about in the performance categories, or more of a general question.
This is Greg. I also want to expand a little bit in that I wasn't sure if this was part of the question or not. The breast imaging codes, CPT codes, are almost universally on the non-patient facing list. So even though you have large numbers of patient interactions, in the absence of billing a specific evaluation and management code, it's very likely that you will still be considered a non-patient facing clinician inside the QPP. And that's variable, but in general, that's a true statement.
One other thing to mention real quick is when those episode-based measures, Rich showed the 8 that are going to be used for 2019, but CMS is working on a bunch of others. There are 11 more that went through clinical subcommittees for potential use, and one of those was lumpectomy, partial mastectomy, and I was a part of that committee, and we talked about ways that imaging could be pulled into that. For now, they're going to specifically concentrate on the surgical procedures, but it's very likely in the future that some of our imaging, diagnostic imaging, particularly in the breast world, may be involved in some of those episode-based cost measures.
Okay, thank you. There is a question submitted by Mara Nordhorn. What kind of patient qualifies as a complex patient?
Sure. So I can talk about that. So there's a very specific way they describe it. And again, it involves math, but it involves something called dual eligibility, meaning Medicare and Medicaid, as well as something called HCC, your hierarchical condition category. So they use these, and there are actually links to them in the web in the rule, but you can go through and sort of read about how they do it. But they use these 2 scores, the dual eligibility and your HCC scores for the patients. Greg or Warren, would you add anything to that?
No, I would say that in general, radiologists end up a little higher than average for risk scoring compared to other clinicians. There's been several papers in JACR that have shown this. The clinicians that typically get the highest risk scores are nephrologists. So I would expect maybe a few points added to risk scoring for radiologists, but in general, I wouldn't expect the entire bucket of risk scores to be put into the radiologist scoring methodology. And these are long-standing methodologies for Medicare to determine risk. They've used them throughout the Medicare Advantage program and multiple other different entities that they look at risks.
Okay, thank you. We do have a question from, and Mara, thanks you for your answer. There's a question from Gretchen Maris. Is RScan possible to use in the setting of a teleradiology group that reads 60% remote from the 50 facilities that we read for?
Yeah, this is Lauren. There's no reason RScan has to be an in-person communication. It's really founded on sort of this educational process between the ordering and the referring physician, and I don't see why you have to be in the same facility. It can easily be done by teleradiology. Nancy Fredericks may even have some examples of people that have done that. We could certainly get back in touch with you and let you know if there's a precedent for doing that. But I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to.
Yeah, I agree with Lauren 100%. If there's no precedent, it still makes comments. It certainly can be done that way and may actually establish relationships in a setting that are a little bit harder to establish relationships via teleradiology.
Okay, thank you. There are no additional questions at this time.
I have one. I can ask Lauren one because she made a comment that I'd like some expansion on. It also set up our next webinar on APMs. Lauren, you made a comment earlier that a number of those who are currently participating in the shared savings program may be exiting the program and entering MIPS, which to me seems backwards that they would be going down the escalator of value. Can you expand on that so that we can prepare our members for the next webinar, which will be on alternate payment models?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't want to spoil the webinar that's coming up on APMs, but CMS has made a lot of changes to the structure of APMs, and mainly they're trying to get them to accept two-sided risk earlier and mandate the two-sided risk. They really think that that's where the savings are for the system in general, and so they're trying to push people out of the one-sided risk that's available currently. We can go through all the details of the new tracks, the basic enhanced track that they've proposed. But essentially, I think the consequence of that is that a lot of people are going to drop out of APMs, given the alternative of either going and being forced into two-sided risk or not participating at all. I think a lot of them are going to choose not to participate at all and back out and back into MIPS. So we're going to have a different pool of people into MIPS. And CMS even acknowledged that Azar said that he expected a lot less participants, but that he thinks that they're going to get more bang for the buck in the ones that are in the two-sided risk. So I think that that's the motivation between that, and I think it certainly we can talk about it more in the APM webinar and go through a little bit more of those details later.
Thank you, Lauren. And Lauren specifically talking about the shared savings program alternate payment model, which again we'll expand on in just a few months. We're going to have that organized, and we already have speakers in mind and are preparing it now. So at this point, if there's no other questions, we are at the top of the hour. I really want to thank Dr. Golding and Dr. Heller. I think personally, I think they did a fantastic job. They made a program that's quite complex, I think easier to understand. They stressed the points that I think our members have asked, namely small practices and what's going on with multi-specialty groups. And I want to thank them for all their hard work. They've really been incredible teammates, and I couldn't ask for two better people as support on top of the radiology ACR staff. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll send out advertisements in the next few weeks about our next APM webinar. Thank you. Take care.